Hello and welcome back to An Exchange of Ideas, the Oxford Exchange's companion podcast. This week we're going to be focusing on Brexit, the Lost Generation, and I am joined by...
I'm Dylan, I'm a former editor-in-chief of the Oxford Blue.
I'm Ava Doherty, who wrote the article that we'll be discussing, and I'm the former editor-in-chief of the Oxford Student.
And the reason that we are here is because we are approaching the 10th anniversary, can you believe it, of the EU referendum that saw Britain vote to leave by 52% to 48%. Now, you wrote an article on this and the lost generation that came about as a response to it. You know, what made you want to discuss this topic?
So essentially, I was about, let's say, 11 when this happened. It was one of my formative memories, I think, in regards to politics, and essentially in regards to the direction that Britain was going in at the time. And I think what really compelled me to talk about it is that it's very much like, you know, the sort of drunk uncle at the party. You don't mention it, it's there. It's the sort of thing that you should mention, probably, you know, discuss, dissect, get to rehab, and then you sort of don't end up doing that.
So are you saying that Brexit is an alcoholic?
No, I'm saying the relationship between the EU and the UK was incredibly tumultuous and had a lot of addiction problems. And essentially, we decided to solve that by, you know, saying they were the problem rather than looking inward. And I think a lack of self-examination is always a problem. And as a nation, I think, as you both know, we have a tendency to not look inward on certain things. And I think the EU referendum's anniversary has really sort of compelled us to do that, or should compel us to do that, hence the podcast.
Yeah. Well, you talk about this lost generation. So what do you mean by the lost generation?
So it will probably sound a bit narcissistic, but I'm part of that lost generation. Surprise, surprise.
Yes.
So essentially, it's the people that came of age when Brexit was finally enforced. So as you both know, the EU referendum happened in 2016, but the actual Brexit leaving was 2020, end of 2020.
Christmas Eve, that was the big announcement. We were all having fun with Christmas, and suddenly, bam, Boris is on the screen talking about EU deals.
Well, this is just an aside, but if you were having fun at Christmas, I think the police would be round your house, given that it was 2020.
Yeah.
But anyway.
I mean, it sounds very Orwellian. I mean, I was just with my immediate family, but still.
Yeah.
Same can't be said for number 10.
No. I don't think Boris was ever with his immediate family, but anyway, that's a completely
That's often true.
The lost generation.
Yeah. So essentially, the lost generation tended to be us, and tended to be generations that came of age sort of around, let's say, I want to say, you know, 2024, 3 years after sort of Brexit was enforced, and it affected, you know, schemes that were there for young people. So the EU Development Fund had really affected people's lives in terms of what it had allowed us to do, what it hadn't allowed us to do. And some of the projects that had actually been financed included Horizon, Erasmus, and Culture and Arts Abroad. So just for context, a quick explainer, Horizon was the research scheme for scientists collaborating abroad. So whilst we have now rejoined, there was a period in which it was a bit tumultuous and nobody knew what was going to happen to funding. So that largely affected our generation and generations before us, who may have been doing their attempts at master's research, wanting to go for undergrad abroad, or, you know, doing a DPhil, and they were then told actually the science funding had just been pulled from under their feet. Erasmus, it was, you know, year abroad, stuff like that. Where were you going to study? Funding for that. We left, and now we're rejoining in 2028. But it largely did affect us quite a bit, because it not only created uncertainty, but funding and scholarships were pulled at the last minute. And whilst there have been attempts at year abroads, you know, as baked in for the programme, and then the sort of ad hoc attempt at the Turing scheme, it hasn't quite reached the heights of the Erasmus scheme, which was pretty much quite, you know, solid and well constructed, because it had been there a while.
And it doesn't really help the current generation, does it? Because even though it's coming back in 2028, they don't get that chance, those people who are currently studying, to access that scheme. And so I know there'll be some people thinking that rustication has never sounded so good.
Exactly.
But, yeah, it's tough on people currently studying, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, 2027, it's bye-bye to us. And it's a bit like, well, if we just waited another year, I could have had a proper year abroad in France, learning how to do actual, French pan-European journalism with somewhere like Le Monde. But because of, this sort of...
Why Le Monde?
Le Monde's an incredibly well-written, prestigious publication, and I think if I'm going to learn anywhere that's not the Oxford Student or the Ox Blue, I'd obviously...
Or the Oxford Exchange.
Yeah, I'd obviously pick Le Monde. But yeah, and instead, you're going to have to package it up with schemes like abroad in like sort of Columbia or Yale or stuff that do a year with these sort of European schools, and then you're sort of desperately scrambling for an internship or a scholarship to pay for all of that. And it's like, I wish I'd just been born a bit earlier or later, really, and that kind of would have helped. And then the last thing I was going to just briefly point to was the Culture and Development Fund, where if you try to go to Paris, let's say you've saved up for a coach ticket on a Flixbus, and you manage to get to Paris, it's actually double, if not triple the price to get into the Louvre if you're a student who is British than if you were part of the EU, as my friend who's not with us, who's half German, has a German passport and can get in for very cheap, whereas I have to pay upwards to about 30 euros. And I can say this now, students don't have that kind of money for cultural access.
And returning to the kind of overarching theme of this all, which is Brexit, there's an interesting thing I've noticed that still goes on, which is despite the fact that opinion polls have largely a majority of people expressing support for the idea of rejoining the European Union or getting closer to the European Union, it's remained a very politically toxic topic. And you find that people don't really want to reopen that can of worms. I mean, it's been tried in the Labour leadership election that doesn't really exist yet, but does exist. We've had a few people talk about it. You've had Rachel Reid express a desire to get closer to Europe, Sadiq Khan, and every time there's been media outrage and people saying, no, you can't go back on the mandate, on what the people have voted for, despite the fact it was 10 years ago. Why do you think that persists?
I think that's really an interesting question in both aspects. If you'll allow me, I'll start with a brief anecdote, which is sort of talking about how I was interning at a magazine over the Easter break, and I remember one of the articles that came in was about Brexit, and it was just after Reeves's Euromaidan lecture in which she'd expressed that desire. And someone said something like, oh God, we've got absolute Brexit fatigue, we're bored of Brexit, etc., etc. And I think what that really speaks to actually is not just a lack of an appetite in the media market to talk about Brexit, but actually within the electorate, in a sense, because we made it so politically toxic. I mean, it sort of became a bit like, so binary in the sense that the Conservative Party formed their entire identity in 2019 over get Brexit done. And, there were parties on the left that made it very clear that they would consider remaining, whether that be, parts of the Labour Party. I mean, they were very unclear where they stood. Or, the Liberal Democrats were really clear.
Their slogan being a certain words to Brexit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it was really, really difficult to row back on that when you've made such a, clear promise that, you are the party of Brexit, and then you sort of get rid of the Remainers in that party. That if you're now trying to sort of row back on that and say, actually, I think we should have a discussion about Brexit, that would not only hurt the electoral chances of the people in power, but it would also reopen, I think, old wounds. And given the sort of state of fragmentation that Britain's in at the moment in regards to immigration, in regards to the sort of, as we've seen the Belfast, sort of riots, sort of policing, the sort of discussions around that, adding Brexit to the mix is a bit like adding, ethanol to a fire. You don't want to make everything worse and sort of make things combust. But I do think that there needs to be a sort of honest discussion about Brexit, because I spoke a lot on my documentary I made about Brexit a while back about immigration and what people were promised. And actually, immigration of, this is quite interesting, immigration of non-white immigrants from Nigeria and India actually increased under the Tories, whereas levels of migration within the EU to the UK decreased in that time, but there was an overall sort of increase of immigration. And I think it's disingenuous for the Conservative Party of the time to claim that actually, you know, immigration in the way that the people who were voting for Brexit had gone down, because a lot of the electorate that I spoke to who had voted Leave were very clear that immigration in all areas should go down, not just immigration from EU countries, but they thought that actually it was the mandate of the EU and the UK's deal that would be able to control the immigration from non-white or non-EU countries, largely India and Nigeria, which it wasn't able to do, and which Brexit, in the way that it was delivered, was not able to do. And I think the Tories were quite disingenuous in how they sort of marketed that immigration promise, to be honest. And as you both know, there are people now who are saying Brexit hasn't gone far enough, and there are people who are saying that actually it shouldn't have happened at all. So we'll never actually know whether or not Brexit, in the way that these parties were thinking, could ever have materialised, because the ideas are essentially different. We didn't agree on a single idea or notion of how the deal should have been.
It was just a binary question: yes or no, leave or remain. And
nothing about the customs union, nothing about anything else. We weren't told about which, you know, markets we wanted to stay in. We know that the ECJ has access over Northern Ireland. We weren't asked about any of that. We weren't asked about agricultural deals with part of Northern Ireland. We weren't asked about whether we wanted a hard or a soft border. We weren't asked about whether the Windsor framework that ended up being instituted in 2023 was something that we wished for. All of these questions essentially weren't asked because, as you know, the referendum ended up being a yes or no. And my fun fact is, you know what one of the biggest questions on the domestic search engine for Britain was? The day after the referendum?
What is Brexit?
No. What is the EU?
Oh.
Which, if I'm honest, doesn't fill me with hope.
No.
And I think that's not on the electorate to know what the EU is. That's on politicians to inform them.
The interesting thing was, during the EU referendum, the Leave campaign overspent.
Oh, yeah.
During that referendum campaign. So essentially, it wasn't an even contest. And if you look at the way that it was covered in the press, there's very much, for example, the BBC wanted to have a very balanced approach, even though the vast majority of experts were saying economically, Brexit would be detrimental.
But the issue is...
And now it's seen, the BBC recently has said, that basically as fact, that Brexit has harmed the economy.
I think the issue with making claims like that, regardless of whether it's true or not, is the fact that the future, to quote Martin Wolf, is unforecastable. And given that the future is unforecastable, trying to get experts on to, you know, predict these outcomes to the public sort of gets the public in this sort of scared mood, because the Remain side were like, oh my God, there's going to be pestilence and death and everything's going to be awful if we leave, which it was like Mr. Doommonger, which no campaign wants. And then Leave were like, oh, there's going to be sunlit uplands ahead. It sort of became a bit of a sort of binary characterization.
Walking through fields of wheat, sort of happy, sun shining,
and you have to
fearing a
remember
farmer.
As well, I do get a bit irritated sometimes when politicians like to claim everything's about the economy, that voters vote on the economy, because that just completely doesn't tally with what my lived experience is with how most people decide to vote. Certainly in neighbourhoods like where I come from in Luton, people do vote on cultural issues. Cultural issues do matter, and the salience of immigration does matter. And if people were being told, vote Leave to reduce immigration, that will strike a chord with people. And I'm not sure that the Remain side did have as compelling an argument to try and match that.
There is an economic dimension. It's just not something people are massively conscious of.
Areas that actually voted for Leave the strongest and voted on an anti-immigration bill were areas with the highest percentage of, to use the words according to the government, native white British participants. So we see this with Fareham, which then became Fareham and Waterloo.
Suella Braverman.
Suella Braverman,
Exactly. And it had one of the highest percentages of actually, like, just people who'd lived there for generations living there, and hardly any immigration, and yet they came out strongest for Leave. So a lot of this is the distinction between the psychological, like the imagined, and the real, and what actually is the case. And I think someone said glibly, oh, well, they're just voting to keep immigrants out. But actually, I think it's not that. I think it's the degree to which the media and the press are able to construct a narrative of saying, actually, you know, we're being swarmed, using words like swarmed by immigrants, that creates this sort of, you know, defensive mindset that decides to vote to leave. And even in areas where this isn't, this so-called threat is more imagined than actually real. And I think that's something that needs to be focused on. And as a last point to what you were saying, Jason, about how they don't seem to care that much about the economy. I mean, we see with the polling just before the referendum that people would actually vote for decreased levels of immigration, even if it was economically detrimental to the country. So the electorate has been very clear that actually, overall, they would just vote to get rid of, you know, a lot of hardworking, in some cases, you know, people who they're just choosing to get rid of from the country. And it's not a case of really making those distinctions between legal and illegal migration. I mean, there's a whole debate as to whether migration should be considered illegal at all, but that's a different discussion. But a lot of those binaries and distinctions are sort of getting collapsed to the degree in which people aren't understanding that, you know, the differences between asylum seekers, economic migrants, etc., but just saying as a homogenous thing, we want immigration decreased to the point that even if it's economically detrimental to the country, to do that, really. So I think that's a real strong indicator of the sort of mindset, at least, of a lot of the electorate, shaped not only by lived experience, as you were saying, but shaped by where the press and the media narrative is choosing to go.
Another interesting point, to go back to the theme of the lost generation, is that obviously things have not stayed static in the last 10 years. The voting blocks in this country have changed. I mean, you have 10 years worth of people who very sadly have died off, and in their place have come 10 years worth of people who are in that lost generation, who have come of age, who are now eligible voters. And so it's kind of quite interesting that a mandate from 10 years ago is considered very valid in that way, when we don't consider, you know, the Boris Johnson 2019 landslide as being a valid mandate anymore. What do you think that, by and large, the 10 years worth of new voters that we are all part of think of Brexit at this point?
So this is the thing, right? I think 10 years is a very long time, as you said. A week is a long time in politics.
A day is.
Yeah. At this point, given how many prime ministers we've had, a day is a long time in politics. At one point,
Liz Truss was prime minister for fewer days than Hugh Grant was when he filmed Love Actually.
I know,
a day is about 2.5% of Liz Truss's premiership, isn't it?
The lettuce lives on.
But I think the point that I'm essentially trying to make is that, yeah, like, you get resignations in the morning and then you get people pulling back in the afternoon and going, actually, I didn't want to resign, or vice versa. But yes, 10 years is a long time, I think. But also the generation of voters that have come in. I mean, we've seen from the New Statesman stuff like angry leftist women, which I debate that strongly about the idea of angry. But you see a lot of new generations. The gender divide's got massive in the country, and the new generations that are coming. You know, there's the rise of the manosphere, the rise of some very legitimate concerns about relationships between, you know, men and women and where those go. But I think also, essentially, the landscape has changed. Not only have we had a global pandemic since, you know, the EU referendum, not only have we had, you know, the war with Iran,
war in Ukraine as well.
War in Ukraine. Essentially, there's been a lot of international conflict and global problems that have meant that that have meant that the voting base and their concerns have changed. And the naivety, I think, sometimes that parts of the press show in saying that actually we don't think that international concerns affect how voters vote in the UK on a sort of local or national level, I think something that needs to be reconsidered. I think people feel very strongly about these issues, and essentially, whilst I think the main thing that people should be focusing on are, you know, the concerns to them and how they vote, I think parties also need to catch up. So if I think we went back to talking about Brexit and how it should be formulated and what should be done about whether, you know, we rejoin the customs union, etc., what we do. I'm not suggesting anything. I think all these new concerns need to be considered, like things like our relationship or the so-called collapse of the special relationship with Trump needs to be considered, about whether we need to want to cozy up to von der Leyen. You know, essentially, we need to realize that we need allies. You know, yes, we were able to act really fast on things like the COVID response and war with Ukraine, even without the EU. But are there things that are better done within the EU? Things like, you know, migration deals. Does it cost us more with France actually not being part of the EU? You know, the security queues, what it's like traveling, access to the Schengen area, you know, the database for criminals. You know, essentially all of these things really do need to be considered, and a lot of them actually need to be considered within the context of the new developments that have happened, such as, you know, what does it mean in regards to global pandemic access and how we sort of coordinate these sort of responses.
I mean, it was interesting that we got our vaccine rollout much more efficiently rolled out than Europe.
Exactly.
But that was partly due to us manufacturing
AstraZeneca,
the AstraZeneca vaccine, which, was our advantage. But with something like that, is that a sign that we shouldn't be in the EU, or is it more a sign that the EU could learn stuff from us, just as we learn from them?
I think I do have to also credit a lot of people who've said that, or made the point that the EU is a declining share in trade, a declining share trade bloc. But the issue is the Trans-Pacific Partnership makes up 0.007% of our GDP.
CPTPP, isn't it?
So at this point, it's like, okay, we've got to pick our sort of deals, but also what is being part of the EU going to benefit, or how is it going to benefit us? Is it just in terms of being part of that declining share of trade? Sure, but what does it mean for security? What does it mean for cultural commitment? What does it mean for other things? And do the benefits of rejoining the EU outweigh the costs? And I think if we're talking about that, yes, we will probably get punished if we rejoin, as in the cost of rejoining from those other member states is going to be ridiculously high. I am aware of that. A lot of the politicians and parties have been made, you know, incredibly aware of that, not only by von der Leyen, but by other people in the EU Parliament who've said, you can't just do this in and out hokey-cokey type business and expect us to, you know, not want to slap a huge legal bill on. So I think being pragmatic, it's not just about a simple decision of stay out or rejoin. It's more, how can we maximize our relationship with the EU in turbulent times like this, in which our sort of the reliability of our allies in America is sort of completely shot, because they're making decisions from the White House that are, you know, really not necessarily always considered, to put it lightly, which means that we can't really depend on their support when we need it. I mean, we've stayed out of the war with Iran, but is it always going to be the case that we can stay out given our dependence on America? So I think if we had relationships with the EU and that was done properly, maybe it would make it easier for us to stand up as a collective against sort of being pulled into geopolitical conflict. Because as a lot of the parties have said, essentially, you know, the first thought in the British government's mind should be the British citizens. Sure, so following on from that logic, we should really consider what the British citizens want in this case. And I think that would be to largely stay out of the geopolitical conflicts that America are enacting.
And I guess finally from me, we've had 10 years since the Brexit referendum. Where would you say that you see this going in the next 10 years? So the UK's relationship with the EU?
A decade in sort of preview.
Yeah, I think in relation to this, it depends. Is it my optimism? Is it what I wish would happen? Or is it the reality of what will happen? Because if I was being optimistic, I'd say, you know, we'd go back, sit down at the negotiating table and go, I think personally we should perhaps, you know, have a closer economic deal in some sort of way. I think we should sort our migration policy out. And then I think we should have designated areas in which we keep our relationship with the EU. Whether that's rejoin, I'm not sure I'd go as far to say that. But, and I mean, we've kept a large percentage of EU legislation anyway. So it's just a question of how we continue to legislate on things in a way that would benefit us. In the reality of what I think is going to happen, I think there's going to be another Rachel Reeves who each year comes out at the Euromaidan lecture and gives a speech about the importance of being closer to the EU. Then the Bank of England's going to suggest at some point, oh, maybe we should be. Then there's going to be a different policy wonk that turns up and goes, no. I think it's just going to be an eternal argument and an eternal dialogue until we either get, a reform government, in which case the reform government's going to be probably with Nigel
I think they're going to back Brexit.
Oh, really? At the helm, with Nigel Farage at the helm, it will be very clear that actually, leave means leave. We're not going to renegotiate with the EU. Fine. That's a very clear position to take. Or we're going to have some sort of left-wing coalition in which we don't actually necessarily have a clear position because all the left-wing coalition will sort of argue about the ins and outs. And then it will be sort of, maybe we should do something, and it will be the eternal hokey-cokey, which I think the Tories currently are also in the eternal hokey-cokey because no one's got a clear policy platform yet. And that's, sorry, just to be clear, that's not me necessarily saying that reforms plan to just be very clear about leave meaning leave is necessarily the right one. It's just that Nigel has been incredibly clear about the fact that leave does mean leave. So in his case, he's not going to go back to the negotiating table, whereas the left haven't completely ruled out doing that, which means that they're sort of doing the eternal wrangling of what do we do? How do we do it? Should we maybe have a conversation about this? And a conversation is well and good, but successive monologue and dialogue about this for over 10 years is probably not what the electorate wishes to happen.
And it's something very interesting. And if you have anything to say on it, for those watching the podcast right now, let us know what you think about what will happen to Brexit and the UK's relationship with the EU in the next 10 years.
Thank you for joining us, Ava, and thank you for watching/listening, viewers at home. We have been The Lost Generation. Brexit has been Brexit, or as we call it, a dilemma. And this has been an exchange of ideas. Till the next time.
Bye.